up, guys? Welcome back to the basement. I'm here, toolbox, Bert, whole nine. It's way too early in the morning. I should not still be up. But I just finished getting my little mill and everything set up and tramming it all in. And I was too excited to not play with it for a little bit. So that's exactly what I did. Just started messing around with some stuff, cutting up some plastic and whatnot, and I'm pretty out of practice when it comes to milling, so figured we'd play a little with it. So, been a second since we've done a video, obviously. I figured that we would go ahead and catch up on a couple maybe. So, one that I wanted to do, and I've actually done a couple of them, and I'm hoping that I can make a better one tonight, is one that was requested by a longtime cocker shooter a long time ago when I first started doing videos, and what he was wanting to see, in his own words, was the superiority of CO2 versus high pressure air, and why CO2 was better. And what I would like to do instead is actually a comparison of the pros and cons between CO2 and HPA. Because believe it or not, neither one is necessarily the superior propellant. CO2 has pros and cons, HPA has pros and cons. So that's kind of what I wanted to talk about tonight. So CO2, as most of us know, is pretty much where paintball started as far as propellants go. 12 gram CO2s and whatnot. Some pros for it. CO2 is very easily accessible. You can get it for cheap. In comparison, a CO2 tank being 20 some odd bucks versus your cheapest HPA tank being 40 to 60 bucks, for a decent one. There, a lot of the things with CO2 as far as the other pros are a little more technical. CO2 is a very high potential energy propellant. Okay, CO2, when it is bottled, the big bottles that they fill the little bottles with, CO2 is actually pumped into your CO2 tank as a liquid. Okay, so what that means is that it is condensed far enough and compressed far enough that it actually changes phase to a liquid. So there is in a cubic, let's say cubic inch, cubic centimeter, whatever measurement you want to use, a cubic centimeter or a cubic inch of liquid CO2 versus the same measurement of high pressure air, there is more potential energy contained in that CO2 than there is high pressure air, which is why you see guys getting, with like vertical stock class builds and stuff like that, on a well-sprung, well set up stock class build, you can get 40 shots and up on a 12 gram of CO2, which is crazy. 12 grams are tiny. There's not a whole lot of CO2 there, but you're still getting a lot of use out of it, depending on how you have it set up. So now, CO2 is also something that I would definitely recommend for people who may not be playing at their local field all the time. If you're going to be playing out in the woods and you live in the boonies, quite a ways away from a local field where it's hard to get a high pressure air fill, obviously CO2 is much more easily accessible. You may be able to get it from, say, a local sporting goods store, a homebrew supply. I'm honestly several different places that you can get CO2. There's even, for example, if you hit up by Walmart or whatever, and you buy SodaStream CO2 canisters. If I remember correctly, Palmer's actually sells an adapter to use SodaStream canisters as a CO2 propellant or a paintball propellant. They sell an adapter between the thread patterns of the SodaStream canisters and a standard paintball ASA. So CO2 has a lot of pros. As far as cons, CO2 has to be set up correctly. Whatever marker you're going to use with CO2 has to be set up correctly. Like I said, CO2 is compressed to the point that it is bottled as a liquid, which means in order to get the most out of the potential energy contained within that liquid, it needs room to expand and become a gas again. So it needs enough room to expand and become a become the stable pressure range. That's where it needs to get to. CO2 typically puts out around 850, 950 psi, depending on temperature outside and whatnot. But so you have to set up your marker correctly. That's why like expansion chambers were a really big thing when CO2 was the main available propellant, because the more room you gave that CO2 to expand from liquid to gas, the more consistent the pressure is going to be, and the better off you're going to be as far as, you know, not dealing with a regulator. You don't necessarily have to, as long as you give that CO2 adequate room to expand and adequate time to expand. Now, it doesn't work extremely well for super high flow applications, say an electronic marker or electronic cocker. You can also cause problems with CO2 if using it in an electronic marker. Like I said, it needs to expand, so if you were to flush some CO2 rapidly up into a solenoid, and as that solenoid opens, then the CO2 has more room to expand and the pressure can build there, and it may either vapor lock or break that solenoid. So there are some cons to CO2. It also seems to be a little bit rougher on your O-rings. Most of that is just because, again, that principle of expansion. When something goes from a liquid to a gas that rapidly, it absorbs a massive amount of heat. So it is going to chill everything really, really quickly and very harshly. So CO2 can be a little rougher on O-rings. Now, high pressure air. And again, high pressure air, not necessarily the superior gas. It's all application dependent, which is something that we talk about a lot when it comes to autocockers and paintball in general. Depending on what you want from your build, that's where you're going to have to take into account what propellant you use, how it's set up, what kind of marker you're running in the first place. High pressure air, for example, some pros. It tends to be quite a bit, not necessarily quite a bit more consistent. It does tend to be more consistent because the bottles are actually regulated. There is a regulator on your bottle. So if it's set at 650 psi and your regulator is in good shape and all the piston O-rings are good, everything is clean and lubed, you should be outputting 650 psi right up to the point that you don't have 650 psi left in that tank anymore, which is really nice. Now, given most markers out there, you're running directly into an inline regulator, so you kind of are dual regulating already, but it is nice to know that whatever pressure you're outputting at the tank is going to be consistent, relatively consistent, as long as you maintain your tank regulator. Some other pros, it doesn't chill down nearly as much. It doesn't absorb as much heat as CO2 in high rate of fire applications. It will still chill down because, again, that compressed air is going to expand and absorbs quite a bit of heat, so it will chill your marker down a little bit. Pro, con, meh, either way, it doesn't chill down nearly as much as CO2 does. Let's see, some other pros. It's very, very convenient. When filling CO2, for example, it is done by weight because it is pumped in as a liquid. So a 20-ounce CO2 cylinder, it has to be taken off the marker, put on the scale, and attached to the adapter, then pumped in, weighed out. You have to do it correctly. Whereas high pressure air, you have a 3,000 psi tank, you hook up to a 3,000 psi fill station, bang, boom, on we go. 4,500 psi, same thing. So it is extremely convenient as far as filling. If you're out there playing in the middle of the day, you're talking 5 minutes versus 30 seconds. I mean, it's really not that bad to fill CO2, but high pressure air is extremely convenient. The range of readily available cylinders is really nice with high pressure air. You can get whatever you need to fit your application, which, again, you can do with CO2, depending on how hard you want to look. They are not as readily available, but CO2 canisters are available in a wide range of sizes. High pressure air, readily available in a wide range of sizes. Everything from a commonly available 13 cubic inch all the way up to a commonly available 88 or a 114 from First Strike, whatever it is. There's a wide range depending on what application you're trying to fit for high pressure air cylinders. Oh, excuse me. Now, some cons as far as high pressure air. Like I said, with CO2 being the choice gas for if you're playing kind of out in the boonies, high pressure air is the exact opposite. If you are not around a paintball field or you don't happen to have a couple scuba cylinders laying around, you're probably not going to find somebody with a 3,000 or 4,500 psi compressor just hanging out in your town. More than likely, your local hardware store does not have a 3,000 psi compressor. So you're going to have to go to a paintball field to get your tanks filled, or deal with having a couple scuba cylinders, bringing your own stuff, and then only having 3,000 psi fills, also having the adapter to go from a scuba to a standard fill nipple and whatnot. A couple other cons. High pressure air is much more expensive to get into. As far as, shot for shot cost, CO2 is by far the cheaper propellant to work with. For example, at my local field, we sell a 20-ounce CO2 tank for about $22. Complete, that's full, $22. And depending on how, it's going to fluctuate a little bit with outside temperature, but you're probably looking, 600 to 900 shots pretty easily out of, say, a Tippmann 98, something like that. Whereas with a high pressure air cylinder, let's say a 48 cubic inch 3,000 psi, your baseline HPA cylinder, you're looking about 600 shots, maybe 700. Fact is, like I said, there's a lot more potential energy available in CO2 than there is in high pressure air. So you do have to use a bigger tank. Now on the flip side of that, high pressure air tanks, aside from say 48 3Ks, are typically quite a bit lighter in comparison to the volume of what they're carrying. So like I said, there really isn't necessarily a superior propellant. It all depends on application. And that being said, there have also been some other propellants. For example, CO2 is where we started. Then we moved into constant air CO2, which instead of 12 gram CO2 cartridges, then you would start using the larger bottles with the pin valve on them. There for a while, the industry moved towards nitrogen a little bit, which was kind of an odd middle ground stepping stone between CO2 and high pressure air. When high pressure air first came out, it was a very expensive technology, so nitrogen was available a little bit cheaper, and it was a little more consistent and easier to mess with than CO2 was, but it wasn't convenient enough to really stick around. Then you stepped into high pressure air. You've also had a couple goofy ones out there, like the Tippmann C3s, for example, was a pump gun that Tippmann produced that was actually propane powered. So you could use that little green Coleman propane gas cylinder that you put into your little camping grill. You would use that as your propellant cylinder, and it actually had essentially a small sparking plug. Is kind of the way that it worked. They were actually kind of interesting. They were available with auto trigger, and if you really got to ripping on them for a while, you could feel the chamber heat up. But they were incredibly efficient because it was an actual combustion propellant. So it was really cool technology, but obviously playing with propane was a little sketchy, so they didn't last very long. They're still around out there on occasion. You can find them. So that's pretty much just a quick summary as far as, like I said, not necessarily the superiority of propellants, but more quite the opposite, the equality of propellants. It's all application based. So it really depends on what you want to do. As always, guys, if there's anything that I did not explain very well or anything that you would like me to cover a little bit better, let me know. Again, sorry, I have been slacking, had a bunch of stuff going on, bunch of builds, completely restructuring the shop, picking up the mill, getting everything set up. I literally spent all day today tearing it completely apart, putting everything, cleaning, oiling, tramming, and just adjusting the crap out of everything. So it has been a long day. Hopefully I'll be able to get a little bit of practice, make some neat stuff for you guys. And I am looking forward to getting some other projects done here. So we will talk to you guys next time.